I'm Kathy Lind, and I want to welcome everybody on the Zoom link. And I'm happy to tell you that it is being recorded. So if you know people who are missing it, it will be on the church website. And if you can't find where it is, contact one of us and we will direct you on the website. Today, I'm going to be introducing Lanier Smythe, who did a wonderful program with us in September on the textiles that she learned about from her trip last spring to Uzbekistan. And she had also had planned to do the architecture of Uzbekistan, but she was so thorough and the photos were so wonderful that she never got to the architecture.
Uh,
So she graciously agreed that she would do the second part of her program in January. And so in a little bit, I'll hand it over to Lanier. But just for those of you who are keeping track ahead of time, to save the date for the second Thursday of each month. Next month, we'll be having Mark Rosenstein, and it's on February the 13th, just before Valentine's Day, and he will be treating us to more of his underwater photography on growing up on the reef and how some of these fish change over their life cycle, and that will be really interesting. In March, we're going to have Richard Waring, who's also here today, and Richard took a trip with some church people to Ecuador and then to the Galapagos also late last spring, and so he's going to be presenting some of the things that he learned and photographed, and that's it's a place I've always wanted to go, and this is probably my way to go there. In April, we're going to have Andrea Prestwich, who is a church member, and she now works for NASA, and she does a really wonderful job doing programs at a level that we can all comprehend. And she's chosen to do it on gamma rays this time. So that will be on April the 10th, which is the second Thursday in April. So I will now turn the program over to Lanier, whom you all know. And Lanier, want to tell us about your trip and about the architecture in Uzbekistan. Thank you.
yes. So first of all, welcome to you all from me, and thank you, those of you who are here, for showing up, and for those, particularly those of you who were here when I talked about the textiles, being willing to hear me run on even more about my trip to Uzbekistan. It was really so much fun for me that I'm delighted to have a chance, and also to have a chance to get to know, just by trying to organize my thoughts, a little bit more about this architecture. Architecture in art history has always been my love. I'm happy to share that enthusiasm, and hope that by the time we're through, you will share that you will share my enthusiasm and not just be my enthusiasm. When I taught, which I did for decades, my goal was, particularly for the architecture, to have my students experience what it was like to be in the space of the architecture, to experience it through time, through space, by using plans and a series of slides to illustrate what you would experience at one part of a building, on the outside, the inside, looking up to the side, and so on. That's what I try to do, will be trying to do with some of the slides that I have. It also helps to have some vocabulary, so I'm going to start out with a few vocabulary terms. And I like also to try to see things in context, to understand the motivation of the people who built buildings or created art of any form, and see that as a reflection of the society that produced it. I know much less about this society than I did about what I was teaching when I was a professional, but I still try to include a little bit of that when I can. But as a caveat, I am not an expert on this material. I was a medievalist. I learned a lot from this trip, and I've learned more from books since the trip. So this has been a learning experience for me to put this PowerPoint show together. So let's dig in. Let's see now. Oh, yes, I think I can do it this way. No, I guess I can't. Okay, so how am I going to advance? It's not advancing. Maybe this is it. Yes, good. I found it. Okay, so to start with a map, which shows us a little bit about the spread of Islam. Of course, all the architecture that we'll be looking at is Islamic architecture, or all the monumental architecture, I should say, is Islamic architecture. And the spread of Islam, of course, started from the southern, southwestern area of the Arabian Peninsula with Medina and Mecca. And within a century of the death of Muhammad, it had spread to all this purple area and the sort of gray-green. And then within 150 years, it had spread all the way to the Pyrenees in Spain and all the way to Uzbekistan to the east. And remember the RLC, which we looked at when we were looking at maps last time, and the two rivers that come out from that you see here. So this is the area that we're looking at for the buildings that we're looking at today. These are all monumental buildings that we're looking at, things that are built in permanent materials, which of course is replacing the traditional style, which was the yurt, which we looked at last time also, which was something that was not permanent, that was you could travel with, closer to a tent, what we would consider a tent. These are buildings built of permanent materials. They're lavishly decorated, and they're very different from what the nomads of the indigenous population was accustomed to. This map shows the towns that we traveled to and where we saw things. This shows Nukus, but that's very close to the the rebuilt or totally renovated fortress town of Khiva, which I'll show you some slides from. And then I have things from Bukhara and Samarkand. These were all very important routes on the silk trade route. And Tashkent would have been, except it was heavily destroyed by earthquake, and so there's not very much there. And then there are a couple of things that I'll show you from the Fergana Valley. These are two very different areas of the country. This is the steppes, or the plains of the area. It's flat land, it's filled with grass, and it's very windy. And in this area, it's a valley with rivers flowing through it and mountains, and it's very different terrain. Okay, so some of the terms I was telling you about. So here are some of the building types we'll look at. Mausoleums, mosques, madrasas, minarets, trading domes, bathhouses, fortress walls, and residential buildings, both palaces and vernacular, if we get to all of this. I hope we do. And then their building forms, which are found in these structures, in a variety of different ways they're used in depending on the structure, but these are terms that I'll be using. Dome, vaulting, stalactite or honeycomb vaulting, a squinch, tower, entrance portal, Iwan, hypostyle hall, column, including the base, the shaft, and the capital, and a courtyard. Maybe I should have your pictures up, because then I could tell if I'm putting people to sleep. Okay. So the decoration of these buildings is quite lavish. It's tile, or sometimes it's a shaped tile. It's three-dimensional. It has a number of different forms: geometric, floral, calligraphy, arabesque, which refers to a sort of vining, twisting, curving line that has usually floral forms in it. The human form is rarely used, almost never in anything that's religious. It's definitely discouraged in Islamic decoration. You do find it in manuscripts where there is a secular topic, but not in things which are religious. The material is basically brick and tile. These are not heavily wooded areas, and there's not much stone that's available. There's a little bit more available in the area where that's in the valley to the eastern end of the country, but not in the western end. So the first series of buildings that I'll show you are mausoleums. The first one is this very large one. Let me get this out so you all can see all the text now. This large mausoleum that's one of the earliest buildings in that survived in Uzbekistan. Pardon me. It's from the 10th century, so one of the very earliest, but it was lost to knowledge because it was buried in sand and mud. There was a cemetery around it, which kept elevating the level of the ground plane around it. And eventually it was rediscovered only in the 20th century because someone found a document which described enough about where this famous building was that people were able to locate it underground and excavate it and restore it somewhat. But it wasn't in very bad shape, actually, because the mud and sand around it had pretty much preserved it. It's a cube 35 feet on the side and 35 feet tall, with a dome, a rounded dome on top of it, and 4 small domes on the corners, which you can see when you look at the building from the side. It's a sort of, it's described as a jewelry box of a building, or it's just so precious. It's so perfect in a way. The decoration is unglazed. It doesn't have any color to it. It's just the brick and a variety of ways of placing the brick to create different patterns. So there's a sort of basket weave pattern up here and what looks kind of like a checkerboard down here. And then there are rosette shapes which are used. And in the columns up above, a zigzag, which is done with bricks, or something that looks like a spiral column, also done with bricks. Down here, it's something that's called a dog tooth pattern, with the bricks placed so that they're pointing outward, looking like sharp teeth. And then inside, it's the same patterns are used. Again, no color, nothing to adorn the surface. I wanted to go back to this to point out that although the dome is a flat dome, it's the arches, at least for the entrance gateway, is a pointed arch. Much before the pointed arch is used in Western architecture, it comes to be used as, if you all have been following the restoration of Notre Dame in Paris, you see the pointed arch there, but it came from the Islamic tradition. 4 centuries later, we have this very different and very large tomb for Tamerlane, he goes by different names, but Timur the Lame sort of transferred into Tamerlane for this alternate name for him. It was built around 1500, 14th to 15th century. I'm sorry, around 1400, 14th and 15th century in Samarkand. And it's difficult to photograph, but this shows you some of the parts. You can see the entrance gateway over here, the dome, and the bit of the minaret. But I'll show you the parts separately. So here's the entrance gateway. This creates a very formal entrance, a complete separation from the outside world and the inside. And then the rest of it is covered or enclosed by a wall. You can only see part of that because it's not been totally restored, but you can see the part of the wall that would enclose a courtyard that would be on the other side of this entrance gateway. And you can also see the minarets to the side, outside the enclosure of the courtyard. Then looking more closely at the gateway, the lower portion, the lower half of it shows you these forms that I was talking about. You can see here the text, the Islamic script that's used, all from the Quran, as a decorative form. You can see the arabesque. And of course, I didn't say when I was talking about it before, arabesque just really means Arab-like. So it's a French term that was used to describe this very distinctive Arab form that came to be known in other parts of the world. You can see the floral forms easily, and over here it's a little more difficult to see because of the way the sun shines on it, but you can see perhaps that geometry is used as the basis for organizing this area. And then looking up in the upper portion of this arch, you can see the stalactite vaulting, which looks like it's hanging down from the upper portion of the vaults. This is, as I said, called honeycomb or stalactite vaulting. And you go through this passageway, this recessed area, which is known as an Iwan, and I'll show you some others that make this maybe a little bit more understandable than this does, into the courtyard. I don't have any photographs of the courtyard, but I do have closer view of the minaret with its decoration using text of several different ways of forming the calligraphy. This a very geometric formation for it, and this more undulating and curvilinear, and then floral forms and geometric forms for the rest of it. The dome itself is quite an expansion beyond the previous dome that we looked at. This one is ribbed. It's colored in this turquoise that's, again, a French term, the color of the Turks, because, of course, this is used throughout the Islamic world, not just in Uzbekistan. And this dome is sitting very high up. It's a pointed dome, not just a rounded semicircular dome, a pointed dome sitting on a high drum, which lifts it up even higher so that it's visible from quite a distance. And you can see here, of course, these traditional and expected decorative forms that we've talked about. Inside, almost all of this is restoration work. Our tour guide at the point when we were there told us that 5 kilos, which would be 10 pounds, of gold was used to renovate the interior of this vaulting. So the round arch over a square building down below. And this brings us to one of the real concerns of architecture. How do you put a round form over a square base? There are a number of ways to bridge the transition from the square form to the round form, or the round to the square, depending on whether you're looking up or looking down. But the Arab builders preferred the one using what's called a squinch, which builds an arch that goes from one side wall to the adjacent side wall and creates 8 sides then. So you have 4 sides. You can, this is a photograph that sort of distorts the space, but you have arches above the center of each of the 4 sides, and then you have 4 additional arches that go over the corners, and that gives you an octagon on which you can then more closely approximate a circle that you can put the base of the dome on, and that's the case that you see here. So just some brief comparisons between the older building and then the later building, from the 10th century building and the 14th to 15th century building, with the simple, smooth, round dome, or the pointed, decorative, ribbed dome of the later building. No drum on the upper one, but very expanded drum for the later building. And then the monochromatic decoration using just brick forms for the earlier one, or very lavishly decorated tile forms for the later one, and a considerable extension of the entrance gateway itself, elevating it much above what it was earlier. And then inside, of course, there's almost no comparison between the simple brick interior and the gilded interior of the later building. But the shapes are much the same. This uses the squinch also to create the octagonal shape from a square form. Okay, to move to another, in this case, a collection of mausoleums along a passageway, a sort of street of the dead, it's called, in Samarkand, where starting in the 15th century and going into the 19th century, you have a whole collection of mausolea, each one trying to outdo the next. And so you see them here lined up along that corridor or that passageway, without the courtyard that we would have had in Timur's tomb. You just have the gateway, and then you go directly into the space underneath the dome. And as I said, each one trying to outdo the next, but using the same forms and the same colors. Some are very simple and smooth, as you see here, and others are much more decorative. This is the slide that I used for the introduction. I love this slide with these 2 women who are there probably for more serious purposes than we, the tourists, are, and a tourist right behind one of the women. This is an example where the dome and the drum rest directly on an octagonal structure rather than on something that's square that has to be converted to an octagonal base. And then because this goes to the 19th century, some of this looks much more modern, and all of this has been restored. None of this was intact, 100% intact. But because these are materials and methods which are fairly easy to duplicate, the restoration work looks very convincing. It's very difficult sometimes to tell whether you're looking at old or new. Okay, so now to move on to some of the other types of buildings, mosques, madrasas, and minarets, which frequently go together. And that's the case in, well, no, first of all, I want to talk about the 2 different forms of mosque that are used. One is called a hypostyle mosque, and it is a mosque, of course, is a worship structure, a place for prayer, and in ones which are considered the most important mosque, the mosque of the local imam, would have a place for a pulpit for talks. They all have an indication on one wall to tell you the direction towards Mecca. It doesn't need to be anything more than just an indication on the wall. Usually it's a niche of the type that you see here. This is called a hypostyle mosque because it's basically a forest of columns. The hypostyle means under the columns, and it refers to the fact that the roof, under the columns, which means, I guess, the space is under the columns. The roof is supported by the columns. Style is a word that relates to a shaft, and hypo means beneath, so beneath the columns, but it's kind of a confusing term to my mind. But anyway, you'll see when you look inside, it is a forest of columns with a flat roof. A hypostyle hall has so many columns because there's a finite distance that wood can stretch. And so that determines how many columns you have to have. If you need to have a very large space, you need to have the columns fairly close together. And that's what you see at this mosque, which is a Friday mosque, which is what the Juma means, in the town of Khiva. This one was begun in the 10th century, but restored much later. And the wood actually doesn't look terribly old inside. Looking up at it, you can see that. And then also you can see the columns, which are carved of wood also. And every family in the town was responsible for one of the columns, or maybe I should say that the other way. Each column was the property, in a sense, or the responsibility of one of the families in the town. There are more than 200 columns, so more than 200 families were involved in this. This seems to me something possibly like the way in which in early New England churches, people had a box and they were responsible for that, their pew or their box to maintain it. So individual family members maintained their columns. And the columns, here you can see they vary tremendously. It's the shaft with an indication of a capital at the top and then a base. The bases are stone and the columns are wood. And we were told that there's usually a pad of felt between the two to try to absorb some of the vibration if there's an earthquake. Obviously, it doesn't always work. This is another mosque with a bit later than that one was, and it has a very elaborate ceiling arrangement, the flat timber ceiling, but painted, with each bay having a different design, and of course still using the decorative forms that you expect in Islamic architecture. The columns here, the original columns were taken down and put in a side of the mosque to the side rather than being used, and the replacement ones that you see here are all more recent as part of a renovation of this building. Now, the other type, that's the hypostyle mosque. The other type of mosque is what's called a 4-Iwan mosque, and that refers to the 4 sort of recessed areas that you have around a courtyard. And in this case, it's also in the gateway and in the entrance to the mosque. An Iwan is, well, let me back up. An Iwan is a recessed area bound on 4 sides and covered with an arched opening. It is open to the outer space, or in the courtyard, it's open to the courtyard. So it gives you a place for protection from the sun and the wind, but it still has the cooling breeze as a possibility and the light from the outside. It's a place to sit and rest, to talk, to study, depending on what the conditions of the weather were, I suppose. And a 4-Iwan mosque has an Iwan at the entranceway, which this is, the entrance gateway. And then in the courtyard, it has one usually directly opposite, but it would depend on the direction to Mecca, because this would be the main mosque interior section with the Qibla wall, the wall that indicates the direction to Mecca. And then to the side, there would be 2 other Iwans and 2 other hallways that are domed as well, which could be used for prayer and also for lectures or other purposes. And then the rest of the space covered, as you can see, I hope you can see from this plan, could be given over for people who've come for worship and the need for more space. Mosques were supposed to be able to hold all of the town or all of the neighborhood if the city was too large for one mosque to hold everybody at one time. This is a model of the next building I'm going to show you, and you can see just this in three-dimensional form, the shapes, the entranceway over here. Well, I can't get the marker to show, but to the left of the photograph, the entranceway with the two minarets, also minarets at the corners. And where on earth is the, well, I don't know, I can't get the, oh, there's the cursor. Okay. The minarets, smaller minarets at the corners. Of course, the minarets are to call to prayer. So you need it in a really big city, you need somebody going in all directions to call to prayer to make sure that the voice is heard far enough. And then into the courtyard, the central portion of the mosque with the major dome and the wall directing towards Mecca here, and then the two smaller domed areas and the iwans and gateways which precede them. And then shallow domes covering all of the additional worship area that's around the four sides. Sorry, something happening to my voice. So this is the largest one of these, Bibi Khanim, built by Timur the Lame, or started at least by him, in Samarkand. And seeing it from a distance, you can see the major parts of it with the entrance gateway, the smaller minarets to the side, the larger ones which don't have their tops, the smaller domes to the side, the larger entranceway is the entrance into the larger domed area. And because they don't survive, you can't see the other areas. This is a photograph that was on the site that shows you some of the devastation. This building was so big, so large that it was falling down before it was completed. Bricks were falling from the vaulting, and it was deteriorating tremendously within decades of its completion. It may not even have been totally completed. And then as a result of the devastation from it, people began to plunder the building, to take the marble columns. It had marble columns, not wooden columns, and to take the bricks which were falling down, or to take ones which weren't falling down, to reuse for other buildings. So this shows the entranceway in the lower portion of the building into the courtyard, which is filled with trees in this 19th century photograph, or early 20th century photograph. And then the iwans to the side, and the iwan entering into the more focused part of the mosque. I didn't think to say earlier, but it's one of the great ironies that when this area became part of the Soviet Union, Islam was forbidden as a religion, as all religions were forbidden under the USSR. But ironically, it was under that period, during the Soviet period, that the renovations of these monuments began. They weren't to be used as mosques or madrasas, but for other purposes, but they were renovated. I can't help but think that it was an attempt to create work for people so that everybody could have a job. But at any rate, it resulted in these buildings being restored. This has not been completely restored. This is the exterior from the street, from the outside entrance and through the iwan. And this is, it's almost impossible to photograph the, I wonder if you all are texting me. No, somebody else. These are the smaller domes. It's almost impossible to get, once you're into the building, into a position where you can photograph the larger dome. But these are pretty large, with, again, the pointed, ribbed dome with the drum underneath. And a closer view of it. And I think I have still another one. No, well, this is showing that from the side. With this photo, if you were in this space, you would not be able to see this because it would have been covered over with that low, shallow vaulting that I was showing you. And these are the bases of the marble columns that fill this space. Let's see, I don't want to answer that. Sorry, I should have had that muted. But anyway, you can have some sense of the breadth of the space where people would have been on their knees at prayer 5 times a day if they had come to the mosque. So here's another one. It's pretty much identical, except this one is a mosque which is known for its minaret. And it also has some of that covered area still standing, so I can show you that for a contrast. This minaret in Bukhara is absolutely gorgeous, and it was spared when Genghis Khan captured the city and sacked it and destroyed the mosque, which was completed at that point. So it's a mosque rebuilt after his devastation of the building. And but the minaret was earlier, started in the 12th century and continued on. It's monochromatic except for a band at the very top. And interestingly, it changes as it goes up. It's more shallow relief at the lower level, and it gets deeper and heavier at the top so that you can see it, because it will be a more distant view for you to look at. So through the Iwan entrance, gateway entrance into the courtyard, and you see this is more complete, so you can have a better sense of what the two side Iwans leading to the side spaces would be like, and you see the large dome with the Iwan entrance into it on the opposite side from the main entrance. And then these covered spaces, which probably because they're not marble, but are brick piers. You can see the brick base covered with plaster, still forming a sort of forest of supports, but supporting a vaulted structure up above rather than the flat roof that we saw in the hypostyle mosque. This is the next is one of the most majestic of the things that we saw. This is the collection of 3 madrasas in Samarkand, which is called the space, the assemblage is called the Registan, which means the place of sand. Stan means place, and Regi, I guess, means sand. So this means the place of sand. It was basically a marketplace. It was a place of execution. It was everything. It was the main center of the town. And these 3 buildings were built over time. The one on the left was built first in the 16th century and built by a grandson of Timur. And you can show you a detail of the wall of that one. It's very highly geometric with almost nothing in some of these paneled areas beyond just the geometric forms. And that's not the usual case. Usually it's a combination of the different types. On the opposite side, let's see, 2 centuries later, this building was built to match it, and it comes pretty close. It's up on a pedestal, but probably because the ground had risen, you probably had to step down into this building, and this was probably the ground level at the time this one was built 2 centuries later. And it's a little bit more elevated above the pointed arch than this one is, but the basic shapes are the same. And looking more closely at it, and then this one, you can see it actually has figurative forms in the spandrels above the arches. Again, here's my pointer. It has 2 tigers with sort of a sunburst back behind. So having things that are a reference to the real world is except for flowers, is very unusual in decoration. And here you see again the geometric forms, a sort of basket weave geometric form, overlapping lozenge shapes to create a star, an 8-point star up here, and floral forms that are embedded in the background of the spandrels. And then the last building, only a few decades after the previous one I showed you. Unfortunately, we were there when the sun was going down, and this is towards the west. That's why the mosque, this one has a definite mosque shape. These are all madrasas, which are schools for imams in training, young boys who are learning everything about memorizing the Quran and learning lessons about it. This is towards the west, and so the sun's going down in this direction and casting shadows let's see, go back, on the one that was on the right, but making the rest of it more difficult to see in these photographs. This one, as I said, was a couple of decades later than the previous one. And so here you see some of the second story area. And in some of in that one, that was the latest one, it is a 2-story gallery inside. The other 2 madrasas are single story, and these would be cells all the way around. This is looking from the courtyard of one of these. Keep losing my cursor. Yeah, here it is. The courtyard of one of the madrasas. It's lined with cells that the students would use. They would have that for their housing. And the one that I was able to go into is 2 stories. So you go in, it's a very low ceiling, the stair at the back, and then you go up into an upper area, which is much more secluded with a grill like this to bring in some light and air. And you would be completely separate to do your independent study. So a few more minarets. I just love minarets. I think everybody does. I showed you a couple already, but here's one that was at Kiva with multiple bands of colorful tiling, and this one is sloped towards the top. Others look very similar at first glance, but you can see they are different when you look more closely at the decoration. But basically, these are straight-sided ones and pretty much the same in their stalactite vaulting up at the top and the shape of the minaret. Minarets, by the way, I haven't mentioned this, but we think of them as the place where the call to worship is made, someone standing on the top and calling out to the believers in the vicinity that it's time for prayer. But they were also used as a watchtower inside the walls of a city. They enabled anybody, if they were under siege or attacked from outside, to see the approaching army. And then they, during the times of the Silk Road, they served as a sort of lighthouse because if you were traveling across the plains, across the steppe, you might lose your way. But if you could see a tower, that would give you the sense of which direction to go. So a little bit more about the traveling, the caravanserai, and the trading domes and the baths. And so now we're passing to the secular buildings, away from the religious buildings, but you'll see some of the same shapes. I'm going to go a little bit more quickly because I'm hoping to get to something about life in this area before we stop. But so this is the only one of these caravanserai along the Silk Road, not within one of the towns that's made it survive, but out on the road. This one has been excavated archaeologically, and the tops of what's been uncovered capped so that it won't deteriorate further, but it's very difficult to understand anything about it, except you do see the entrance gateway to this, also the same sort of gateway, and then a long roadway that would lead you into the place where you would stay while you were staying at the caravanserai. Caravanserai were basically located every 20 to 40 miles apart, whatever would be a day's travel for that particular terrain. And traders could expect to find a place to stay. They could show their wares there. They could do trading, and maybe that's as far as they would go, turn around and go back, rather than continuing further if they had sold what they had brought with them and wanted to return with what they had acquired. This is one which is in Bukhara, very close to the market there. And you see the double doors, which are too low for the camels to go through, we were told. So donkeys could go through. You would unload from the camels onto donkeys, which would carry things into the caravanserai. And then inside, you can see a little bit better the way there's a smaller opening so that you don't open the whole door until this is like the sort of peephole apartment buildings frequently have for people to look out and see if they want to open the door before they actually open it. So that would lead you into this covered passageway where you see members of our group sitting. And then beyond that, into the courtyard area of this caravanserai. So you'd come through that covered space into this courtyard area, which had a recessed area, which is probably where the donkeys would stay. And then you would unload your packs onto the platform around the edge, and then you would be assigned one of these cubicles where you could stay and show your wares to other travelers, other traders, or to people in the market locally. And this is all very near the markets. Bukhara is amazing for its marketplaces. It's got 3 major markets, which in the guidebook that I used were identified by their original functions, although now they're mostly selling wares to tourists. But the original designation is money changers, market, a jeweler's market, and a cap maker's market. So I'm sure there must have been other things which were sold, but those are the ones that were designated on the map that I had. So these will probably all look somewhat similar, but if you look for small details, you can see that this one has something on top of it, of the major dome of it, and it has a little sculpture of storks, which are plentiful in this area. And here's one which doesn't have that, so you can tell it's a different one. But these have generally the same form, a major dome in the center and then surrounded by smaller domes and entrances, which you would still call iwans because there's the same sort of passageway through a vaulted surface. But although, no, you couldn't call this an iwan because it's not backed on the back. This would just be a passageway. And then this one has a completely different shape from the others with its little cupola on the top of it. So the third one of the three major markets in Bukhara. I was so fascinated by these and I wanted to photograph them without all the people. I know most people looking at slides like to see the people, but I like to see the architecture and the form of the building. So I got up early a couple of mornings while we were there to go take these photographs. So looking up into the brick dome and the plastered piers and lower portions. Also in this market area, there was the bathhouse, and the men's bath was not being used while we were there, maybe just because there were no clients. But in any case, they let us come in, and they had on the wall photographs of what you would get if you signed up for the bath, including the massage. So that's shown in these photographs. And then we were allowed to go through with our cameras, seeing the spaces of the bath, which was quite extensive with, as you can tell, well, maybe you can't tell from the photographs, but as you experience it, it's a number of domed spaces and an area where there would be heat, fire to heat the space and to heat the water that would be used for the baths. And these slabs on the side is where you would sit. And usually in the center, there would be a large platform where the massage would take place. I didn't think to photograph that. I did get to go to a women's bath. I stayed with friends for a couple of days afterwards, and I was the only one who did this, but I was not going to be in a place where there was an ancient bathhouse and not take advantage of it. So I went to the women's bath, which has no men, very prominently displayed on the outside. And it was much homier in its entrance area. There was a long table, and you can see lockers at the back where you could leave your clothes. You were given a large towel to use while you were in the bathhouse, and then a long table where tea would be served at the end. And then this is the passageway into it, which was not as hot. You go through the first door and it's a blast of hot air, but then you realize that this is farther from the heat and this is not as hot as some of the other area. And it was explained to me as being the area where the children would stay so that they weren't exposed to quite as extensive a heat blast. And then back in the back area where just a plastic tub collects the water that's used for the bath. And well, that's all I took for that. I took some others, but that's all I'm showing. All I've got to trying to streamline this so I can get through it. Okay, so a little bit about fortress walls. There were two places where we saw extensive fortress walls, all of which have been rebuilt. None of this has survived intact down to the present day. This is the Wall of Khiva, which, as I said, has been renovated as a UNESCO heritage site. It's used in lots of movies. Dick Kobayashi pointed me to the safety video for Uzbekistan Airlines, and they use this building, this fortress and some of the buildings inside as the place to demonstrate their safety video. If you want to Google that, it's very entertaining, and it also shows you going through this interior, this town. So at the top, there are battlements so that archers could stand and be protected, but then could come out from behind that and throw something or send an arrow out. And then this one is the fortress wall in Bukhara, which has also been renovated. Some miscellaneous buildings. This was fascinating, almost impossible to understand. I'd have to know a lot about observatories, I think, to understand it. Oleg Beg was one of the grandsons of Tamerlane, and he built a lot of buildings himself. This was built in the 16th century, and it was an observatory, which also was completely lost because it was a three-story building above it, but that was lost, and the observatory part, which was kind of underground, was rediscovered, and models have been made of what it might have been like. They, using the building and the underground portion, were able to take sightings of planets and markings, and it turns out that they were remarkably close to accurate when they're compared with more precise markings that an observatory can make today, or measurements that an observatory can make today. And then another type of structure, a new city for tourists in Samarkand. Samarkand doesn't have an old city. It's a modern city, largely modern, with a few places where old buildings are located. So they've built their own new old city so that tourists can have a sense of what it would have been like to go to an old city. And then a little bit about residential buildings, palaces, guest houses, or hotels, and urban homes. So this is a model of a palace, and you can see again the courtyard. Well, first of all, you can see the entrance gateway with its Iwan entrance, and then into the courtyards. And there are different types of courtyards. The one on the left would be the courtyard for the inhabitants of the house, of the palace, and the one on the right would be a service courtyard for the servants to do their work outdoors. This shows you, this is actually in Khiva. The one that I showed you before is in the Fergana Valley, in the valley area. This shows you what was described to us as an Iwan. It's off of a courtyard and surrounded by other buildings of the palace. It's enclosed on three sides. It's roofed over. It has a flat roof in this case, and it's got timber columns supporting it, but it gives you protection from the sun and the wind. And if you have more than these off of one courtyard, you can get out of the sun no matter which direction the sun is coming from. So just a closer view, stone bases, but wooden columns, and the entire surface tiled with these beautiful tiles. And if you look closely, you see a mark that tells you that these are numbered. They would all have been painted and then disassembled and put on the wall in the correct order using the numbering system. So here you see it again, the numbers that are used to make sure they get in the right place. And then they're just nailed onto the wall, as you can see with these nail holes right here on the same place on the other side. And then again, these richly decorated ceilings in the secular building as well as in the religious buildings that we were looking at earlier. And then here's another Iwan that's less elaborately decorated, but still the same structure. And still another one with a different interior. And this is one that's from the 19th century, actually. A number of these palaces were built in the 19th century and are very elaborate. Find this in some of the tourist information because of its elaborations. And some of these have been furnished for tourists, so you have some sense of what it might have been like. But in some cases, we were told that the furnishings were left over from a movie that was made here rather than what it might actually have been at any time that it was used as a residence. There's almost a French look to some of these with these long garters and the white decoration of things inside. In one of these, this particular one in another room, we were given a chance to see what some of the clothing was like. And so one of our group, this is one of our leaders on the left, and wearing this elaborate costume with the pantaloon legs and this horsehair sort of cage that she wears so that her face can't be seen, but she can see out. Through this black enclosure, and then a coat over it. Oh, and I should have shown the side view. It has long arms to the back, which can't possibly be used to show that she never has to carry anything, that she always has a servant to carry things for her. These buildings are also used by newlyweds or to-be married people who come to have their wedding photographs taken, dressed up in these fancy costumes, which are kept on site for them to wear for these photographs. And here, I'm just mishmashing these palaces together rather than trying to separate them, but give you some sense of the richness of these with pools, swimming pools. There would have been ablution pools outside of the mosque, but many of those have not survived. And this is a courtyard of one of the guest houses where we stayed. So charming. All of these were just so wonderful to be in, a little oasis inside the city. This was the one that was owned by our tour guide, whom I told you about before. Just so charming. And the wooden columns supporting the flat ceiling of the same type that you saw earlier. Let me get rid of that. How do I get rid of that? I don't know. I can't get rid of it, maybe. Oh, I didn't want to do that. Okay, let's see, go back to this. Okay, so what do you see? How could we see something of how people really live? Only when somebody's doorway into their courtyard was left open could we have a peek of how somebody lived. And this was in actually Tashkent, where we were in the what remains of the old part of town, and still has some of the same forms that we've seen in the historic parts. But this is more typical. Poorly whitewashed walls, damage to the lower portion where it is more likely to be damaged by rain. The gas pipes, which are ubiquitous, always marked by this bright yellow paint to warn that this is something that you don't want to be knocking a hole in. And of course, they would have been in yurts in pre-Islamic times. No one lives in a yurt now, but they are built, as I showed you last time, as sort of curiosities or for someone's fancy party or something of that sort. Okay, maybe I have 5 minutes to talk a little bit about life and food and other things about life. Assuming that if you unmute yourself and tell me you don't want to hear this, you'd rather ask questions, I'm open to that too, but if not, I'll keep talking. Okay, there were many places where we ate. This is sort of a roadside along the highway rest stop that has very similar look to sort of rest areas that we have on the interstate and the turnpike. This was more casual, tables spread out in the open air with an awning overhead where we had a meal as a group. Not just a pit stop, but a meal for us. And you can see our bus at the back. This was a very lovely place. This was where we saw the mulberry paper being made, which I talked about last time, with these beautiful hangings in the openings. It was open air to the sides and a lot of fabrics used to decorate. And that was used in other restaurants as well, as you can see here, in the ceiling and on the sides to give it a feeling of a tent, sort of. We also went to a nightclub at one point, a triple-storied nightclub with a disco ball at the top. Frequently, our meals were in the homes of the people who were the artisans whose work we came to see. And in some cases, they put on a real huge spread for us, a long table with the best chairs and best cutlery and china put out for us, and lavish display of fruit and nuts and bread and yogurt and everything spread out on the table before we arrived. We might be met with someone washing our hands, or there would always be a place to wash your hands before sitting down to eat, no matter where you were. And here we are in a courtyard around another table. And the same thing here, but just a different view. This shows you one of the very unusual types of furniture that are used for meals. It's a kind of combination bed table. It maybe shows up better here. It's like a bed that's enclosed on 3 sides, a platform raised up off the floor, and then in the center of it, there's a table which would be set, and you would sit around 3 sides of it, leaning back against that enclosure with cushions behind you so that you could get comfortable. This without the, well, I know it's so dark, maybe you can't see, but anyway, this is a better view to see what it's like, I think, with the 3-sided enclosure and the table in the center. Again, just a closer view of what we had: fruit, nuts, raisins, and dates. We would always start with 2 salads for every 4 tables, and then the next, 4 settings, and then the next 4 settings, there would be two more salads. Usually there would be one which would be cucumbers and tomatoes, very lightly dressed. And then the other would be cooked eggplant and peppers maybe, and it would be more heavily dressed. This shows the two of them on the same plate, but almost always the same combination of two salads, one cucumber and tomato and the other eggplant and something else. Occasionally we had something like pasta, but that was very rare. And what you see as the sauce on the pasta is much more typical as the main course. Meat, potatoes, carrots. And here is meat, potato, and carrots, main dish display, much more typical of what we had. I didn't take any photographs of the soup. There was usually a soup between the salad course and the main course. And by the end of the soup course, we were full and didn't need the main course, but it would have been rude not to have some of the main course usually. The desserts were usually from a pastry shop, and they were this one seems to be, I took one of fruit, but usually it was nuts and be similar to baklava but with a much heavier pastry, not the phyllo pastry that we're accustomed to, but much more like a pastry, a pie dough, a very rich pie dough pastry. The national dish is plov, which is like pilaf. And we went to a guest house which did a special pilaf for us, cooked in the courtyard in this large basin, which was large enough to feed all of us, which was probably 20 people by the time we actually sat down to the meal. It's made up of well, rice is on the top of this, but at the bottom would be the meat and carrots and potatoes and raisins, and then the chickpeas and rice would be put on top, and then the whole thing would stew for a while, and then it would be stirred up, a very special way to stir it so that the rice cooks properly, and then it would be served. And here you see just what I was, oh, and a big head of garlic. Or several heads of garlic for one that large would be put in as well. So this is, you can see all of the ingredients on this one plate for a group of people. And because that was our last night, and because our last night happened to be my birthday, and they knew it because I guess we have to show our passports and everything, they had a birthday cake for me, and you can see happy birthday on this. Okay, I've run out of time again, so everybody unmute, and didn't really leave time for anybody to ask any questions, but I mean, I'm willing to stay longer if you all want to, but it's up to the rest of you. Okay, I'll stop sharing. Okay.
Wow.
You could see a little bit in some of the photographs, the landscape and the streetscapes and that sort of thing, which is what I had still remaining to show.
Mm.
Lanier, that was marvelous. Thank you so much.
Well, it's a very brief
Ah.
through a lot of material. I'm sorry. I don't know how to abbreviate.
Oh,
No,
I'm
not
glad.
me.
I've
Glad you
always
didn't.
said I can't tell a short story. When I start telling some event, I have to
Oh.
tell the whole thing with all the details.
Well, your professional understanding and all of it was great. And I want to remind everybody that if you missed Lanier's one from September about the textiles, it is on the church website on the YouTube channel.
Thank you. Okay, you can always ask me questions when you see me.
So Lanier, I was really taken by all the beauty and the tile work.
Oh,
And
it's just gorgeous. Yeah.
And is that tile work still made? And so if new buildings are made, is the tile used the way that
most of what you were looking at is 20th century. It's renovation, restoration work. Yeah, they can do all of that still and do.
Wonderful.
I don't know that they use it on modern buildings unless someone had the money to finance it, but it could be done. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful.
It's very easy to copy because, I mean, it's just brick and tile, and, you know, it's the same materials that they used before are available now. So it's not like the stained glass of Gothic cathedrals, which we don't know exactly how they got some of those colors, you know, or exactly how they did it. This is a different situation. It's much simpler and much easier to duplicate.
Lanier, I was wondering about the minarets. Is there an interior fairly small?
Oh, yes, there's a spiral. No, there's no space. There's just a spiral stair going up through it. Yeah, I could have pointed that out in some of the plans. You could see the spiral stair, yeah, going up. And the tallest one, what?
Well, I just think, wow, that's quite an architectural feat to do a small spiral that tall.
Well, it's built out from the walls. You know, the wall is solid.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, it's just itself, and then there's a hollowed out area which then has the stairs going up it. But you have to be quite an athlete to the tallest one that I showed you, the one in Bukhara, is 155 feet tall. So you can actually enter it at the level of the top of the covered area of the mosque, which is maybe 30 feet tall. So that would cut off 30 feet of it, or at least you would have to live on the roof of that to get, you'd still, if you're coming from the ground, you still have to get up to that level. But at any rate, to go up 155 feet, that's a pretty big walk.
Well, without large cranes in those days, how did they get the dome to go on top of the drum, on top of the structure?
Yes, well, that's always the question of all of these. It's centering underneath that supports things, and they climb up the centering to lay the brickwork. And I don't have any slides to show it, but most of those, not the first one, which was very shallow, but most of the tall pointed domes are two part. The top part is pointed, and the inside part is flat, so there's a space in between. So they were building two domes for that. I mean, that's not unheard of in Western architecture. The dome of Florence Cathedral is double also, but yeah, these are engineering feats with very little of none of our present day engineering abilities.
Wow.
Kathy.
I was taken by the observatory slide you had and
Yes.
cross cut. What century was that built in? Because you
It
said
was built in the 16th.
16th.
Yeah.
Wow. Amazing,
Oh,
amazing.
wow.
And aren't hundreds of stars named in Arabic? I mean, it's
Oh, maybe they're ones that they identified, and yeah. I mean,
yeah.
basically what it is to make it very dark, because it's down underneath, and then there was the building on top. So it made a very dark space so that you could look out into, what's up there without having any other light bother you. And then you could make measurements relative to where the light was shining into that slot of space.
Fascinating.
Amazing.
But
I think
unlike an observatory today where you can swing the telescope around, that slot is in one space, but as the year turns, you'd have a different view of the sky.
I think what's amazing is that we have perhaps a prejudiced idea of our intellect and our culture. And when we look back at that, it's just mind blowing,
Yes, all the science, all the intellect was Islamic in
Just
during the Middle Ages, during the Western Middle Ages, when we were in the Dark Age.
Yeah.
Mm.
Okay, I hope you could get in this sort of abbreviated way some sense of going through those buildings and from the outside. I mean, people talk a lot about and there's been a lot I've read in the paper with Notre Dame opening. The feeling you go into the building and how different it is from the outside, which of course is absolutely what you feel, whether the building has had to be rebuilt as Notre Dame did or not. The Gothic cathedrals do capture that. You have some of that with these, but because the courtyard is a part of it, it's not so much a part of the total structure. It's only when you're in the domed areas, which are usually smaller. They're not as large as the full building. I didn't give you the dimensions on that, but I think the Bibi Hanam, which was the largest one I showed you, the one that was the biggest, it's like 2 football fields across and a football field and a half across and 2 football fields long, to give you some sense of what scale we're talking about.
so Lanier, when you decided to go on this trip, did you have any idea of all that you would see? I mean, it sounds like it was just marvelously organized.
Oh, the trip was very well organized. Oh gosh, it's snowing. I can't believe it.
Yeah, it is. And what group organized it for you? Was there?
Yeah, I don't know. Oh, what group organized the trip? I thought you meant the snow. I did know something of it because I had seen the slides just on a phone of a neighbor who had been on this trip the year before. So she's a painter, and so she was very interested in the architecture and the textiles as well. So I had some idea, but I did not know. I think, I mean, there's no way I can check this out because I don't have people to ask. But we think of Iran as having the best preserved Islamic architecture today, and of course we can't really go see those because it's not so easy to go to Iran today. But I would think that this is the next best. I mean, of course, there are things everywhere. There are Islamic buildings in Egypt and Turkey and every place else. But these were amazing. And the fact that they had this renovation program that the Soviets instigated to repair the buildings means that they are in much better shape than they would have been otherwise.
I'd like to, first of all, I want to thank you. It was really wonderful. And if any of you ever goes to Paris, please go see the mosque there.
Oh.
Because then there's a direct relationship between what you showed us and how this mosque has been built. They also have a wonderful restaurant, by the way. But in addition, they have an extraordinary garden. And it's really, really beautiful. I would suggest you go there, and it's bus 89 in case you're interested.
Thank you.
Lanier, to follow up on Parish's question, what was the name of the group, and how did you feel as a solo traveler with this group?
Well, it's very different for me to be in a group like this. I usually prefer to travel on my own. It was a small group. It doesn't have a name. It's just organized by an American and Bukharan who know each other, and they put these trips together. So long as the American has the strength and will to do it, they'll probably continue. Every year for the last few years, she said it's her last trip. We had 14 people on our trip, and I knew before the trip started, I think I knew 5 of them. A couple of them were friends of mine, and then friends of friends that I met before we started. And so it seemed like I was traveling with a group of friends, and the small size helped with that. But no, I do prefer to travel by myself, but I don't know, those days may be over. I don't know if I'll. Anyone else? Well, thank you all. I hope you have some enthusiasm. I hope you can share my enthusiasm.
Oh, absolutely.
That was
And Lynn, thank you
Mm.
so much for putting this together. I know it was a labor of love and you learned a lot doing it, but you really exposed us to an area of the world that most of us will not have that fortune to go to. So thank you.
No, thank you. You're
I'm so
very
glad
generous.
it's going to be on the church website. So we have to spread
Mm.
the word about the beauty of this. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.